Most people on television are not going to tell you this. They will call what is happening between America and Europe a rough patch, a diplomatic disagreement between friends who have fought before and always found their way back. That is the framing. That is the story being sold right now. Here is the problem. Rough patches do not end with one side rearming for the first time since 1945. They do not end with a sitting French president offering to extend nuclear deterrence to the entire continent, because American nuclear cover can no longer be trusted. They do not end with Germany tearing up an 80-year constitutional commitment to fiscal restraint, specifically to fund an independent military future. You have lived through a lot of transatlantic turbulence. Reagan and the Europeans clashed over cruise missiles in the 1980s. Bush and Chirac publicly split over Iraq in 2003. Trump called NATO obsolete in January 2017, and then America came back. So when someone tells you this alliance is genuinely structurally finished, your instinct is to dismiss it. You have heard this story before. But what happened between February and April of 2025 is different. Not in tone, not in rhetoric, in architecture. In the space of 8 weeks, the European Union announced an $800 billion rearmament program. Germany dissolved a constitutional rule it had treated as sacred for 8 decades, and the EU's own president said publicly that Europe could no longer rely on external guarantees for its security. She did not name the external guarantor. She did not need to. What I see in this alliance right now is not a crack. It is a controlled demolition. And the question is not whether it is happening. The question is who has been building toward it and for how long. Here is the framework. 3 structural breaks, not political disagreements, not personality clashes between particular leaders. 3 civilizational breaks, in defense, in trade, and in values, that when you see them together, make the official story about strained allies impossible to maintain. By the end of this analysis, you will understand the transatlantic relationship better than 95% of the people paid to cover it. And here is the anchor number that makes everything that follows land properly. $800 billion, that is what the European Union's Rearm Europe program, announced in March 2025, has committed to European defense. 800 billion euros. For comparison, that is larger than the entire annual GDP of the Netherlands. The European Union is spending that money specifically because it no longer believes America will show up when it matters. Let that number sit for a moment, because a single budget decision of that scale reshapes every assumption about Western security architecture, permanently. To understand what is breaking apart, you have to understand what was actually built. The Transatlantic Alliance was never simply a military arrangement. It was a civilizational bargain, struck in the ruins of 1945, between a Europe that had just destroyed itself twice in 30 years and an America that had decided, for the first time in its own history, to permanently station itself inside someone else's continent. The bargain had 2 parts. America provides security, Europe provides markets, legitimacy, and a democratic anchor that gives American power moral credibility on the global stage. The Marshall Plan transferred $13 billion, equivalent to $173 billion today, according to the U.S. State Department, to rebuild Western European economies between 1948 and 1952. That money was not charity. It was infrastructure. It was the down payment on the most profitable geopolitical arrangement in modern history. And for 75 years, the bargain held until it didn't. But here is what nobody is telling you. And this is the part that genuinely reframes every headline about NATO, tariffs, and European missiles. The fracture was not caused by Donald Trump. Donald Trump just had the honesty to say it out loud. The roots of this break go back to 1991. The moment the Soviet Union collapsed, the strategic logic that held this alliance together collapsed with it. Europe no longer faced an existential ground threat. America no longer needed a European tripwire against Soviet armor rolling through the Fulda Gap. And for the next 3 decades, both sides spent the peace dividend in completely incompatible ways. America militarized. It spent the unipolar moment projecting force into Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria, building a global military infrastructure that cost, according to the Watson Institute at Brown University, as of November 2023, $8 trillion since September 2001. $8 trillion. While America was doing that, Europe was building a welfare state. European NATO members, with the exceptions of the United Kingdom and Greece, spent most of the 2000s and 2010s at 1% to 1.5% of GDP on defense. The alliance target was 2%. Most members never reached it. Germany, the continent's largest economy, ran defense spending below 1.5% for years. That gap became the fault line. And it was not a secret. In 2014, Robert Gates, former U.S. Secretary of Defense, gave a speech at NATO headquarters in Brussels. He said, "The alliance faces a very real possibility of collective military irrelevance if European members continued to reduce defense spending." That was 2014. Europe heard it. Europe ignored it. In January 2017, Donald Trump called NATO obsolete in an interview with the German newspaper Bild. In November 2019, Emmanuel Macron told The Economist that NATO was experiencing brain death. Two leaders who agree on almost nothing arrived at the same diagnosis, independently, 3 years apart. That is not a coincidence. That is a signal. Then Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and Europe woke up in a way it had not since 1945. Germany announced the Zeitenwende, translated precisely the turning point of an era. Chancellor Olaf Scholz stood in the Bundestag and committed $100 billion to rebuild the Bundeswehr, the country that had spent 80 years deliberately restraining its military as a moral response to its own history. Reversed that commitment in a single speech. That is not a policy adjustment. That is a civilizational pivot. But here is what makes the 2025 moment genuinely different from every prior instance of transatlantic tension. In every previous crisis, the Iraq split in 2003, the financial crisis in 2008, Trump's first term, Europe complained, protested, and then waited for America to course correct. This time, Europe is not waiting. The Rearm Europe plan is not a negotiating position. The $800 billion is not a threat. It is a construction project. Europe is building the institutional architecture, the procurement frameworks, the supply chains, the command structures for a military that does not require American approval to function. And that kind of architecture, once built, does not get unbuilt because the political weather changes in Washington. Former NATO Supreme Allied Commander James Stavridis said in March 2025 that Europe is in the most significant defense buildup since the Cold War. The most significant. Since the Cold War. That phrase should stop you cold. Now consider what is happening on the other half of this alliance, the economic half. Trade and security are not separate issues. They never have been. The Marshall Plan did not just rebuild European militaries. It embedded European and American economies together so tightly that separation became structurally unthinkable. US-EU trade reached $1.3 trillion in 2024, according to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, the largest bilateral trading relationship on Earth. And in April 2025, the United States imposed a 20% tariff on European imports. Let that land properly. A 20% tax on your closest allies' goods. At the peak of a European security crisis triggered by Russian aggression, at the exact moment when European capitals were debating whether American commitments could still be trusted. The European Union's Trade Commissioner, Maros Sefcovic, described it as a major blow to the rules-based international trading order. That is a European official using the language of systemic rupture, not friction, rupture. This is where the two-track structure of this break becomes visible, because the tariffs do not fall on all European countries equally, and that asymmetry matters enormously. For Germany, which exports $160 billion worth of goods annually to the United States, primarily automobiles, a 20% tariff is not an inconvenience. It is an industrial crisis. Germany's entire post-war economic model was built on export-led growth, on American consumers buying German engineering. A 20% levy on that relationship is a direct assault on the economic architecture of Europe's largest member. For France, the calculation is different. France's economy is less export-dependent. And France has nuclear weapons. France has always maintained greater strategic distance from American power. It left NATO's integrated military command in 1966 under de Gaulle and only rejoined in 2009. France has institutional memory for what going alone looks like. In February 2025, Emmanuel Macron offered to extend France's nuclear umbrella to European allies. He said publicly that France was ready to open the debate on European nuclear deterrence, implying that American nuclear guarantees could no longer be assumed unconditional. The last time a French leader made that strategic calculation was de Gaulle 6 decades ago. Now here is the counterintuitive statistic that makes this entire picture click into focus. According to the European Council on Foreign Relations annual survey published in February 2025, drawing on responses from 17,000 people across 15 European countries, 64% of Europeans now say they believe the United States cannot be relied upon as a security guarantor. 64%. 2 years earlier, in 2023, that number was 36%. The collapse happened in 24 months. Not 24 years, 24 months. That is not a shift in sentiment. That is a collapse in credibility. And credibility, once gone in geopolitics, does not return because you want it to. It returns, if it returns, through demonstrated commitment over years and decades. The Europeans are not prepared to wait. This is where your wallet enters the story. The $1.3 trillion US-EU trade relationship is not a number that lives in finance ministries. It lives in supply chains, in pharmaceutical pricing, in the cost of industrial components, in agricultural market access. A 20% tariff cascades. It does not only raise the price of a German car at a dealership in Ohio. It raises input costs across integrated production networks on both continents, affects insurance pricing, affects logistics contracts, affects the margins of companies you have never heard of that supply components to companies you use every day. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated in April 2025 that the full tariff package, if sustained, would reduce US GDP growth by 0.5% annually, half a percentage point. That translates to real income, real job losses, and real household budgets. Not for governments, for people. The Atlantic Alliance was constructed to be mutually profitable. When the profitability calculation breaks down, when both sides begin serious arithmetic about whether the partnership still pays, the strategic logic that sustained it starts to dissolve faster than anyone expects. Here is where the military fracture, the economic fracture, and the values fracture all converge into a single picture. And this is the scenario that serious strategic analysts are genuinely reluctant to say plainly because the implications reach further than most people are prepared to look. The third fracture is the one nobody wants to discuss in polite diplomatic company, because it is not about money or missiles. It is about what the alliance was actually for. The transatlantic partnership was built on a shared story. The story was this: liberal democracy, the rule of law, the protection of individual rights, multilateral institutions. These were the West's collective answer to the catastrophe of the 20th century. NATO was not only a military alliance, it was ideological infrastructure. The values were the point. That shared story is now contested from inside. When Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán traveled to Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin in July 2024, as a sitting EU member state leader, without prior consultation with Brussels, he was not violating the rules of the alliance. He was demonstrating that, for at least one member, the values underpinning it no longer held. When reporting by the Financial Times in February 2025 indicated that internal U.S. administration communications had described Ukrainian President Zelensky as a dictator, European capitals did not read that as a slip. They read it as a signal about what Washington's strategic hierarchy actually looks like. Before continuing, something deserves a full stop. Since February 2022, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, as of March 2025, over 6.7 million Ukrainians have been displaced outside their country. A further 3.7 million are internally displaced within Ukraine itself. Those are not statistics. Those are families, elderly parents, children. People whose entire futures were redirected by the failure of deterrence that preceded this invasion. Every policy argument, every tariff dispute, every question about alliance credibility that follows exists in that context. Those numbers should be present in every room where these decisions are made. They rarely are. Now to the scenario that strategic planners are actively modeling. The European Council on Foreign Relations, in scenario analysis published in late 2024, assessed the probability of what they term strategic decoupling, a process by which the United States formally or informally withdraws from European security commitments over the next 5 to 10 years, at 35 to 40%. Not a full break, not a declaration, a managed withdrawal, a gradual shift of responsibility that leaves Europe neither fully independent nor fully guaranteed. 35 to 40%. That is 1 in 3 odds that the security architecture of the entire post-World War II order ends within a decade. That number is not fringe analysis. That is the European Council on Foreign Relations, one of the most sober institutions in the field. The historical parallel is precise and uncomfortable. Every serious student of modern alliance politics knows the pattern of Britain's withdrawal from east of Suez in 1968, the moment London announced it could no longer sustain military commitments beyond its immediate neighborhood. That withdrawal did not happen in a single dramatic announcement. It happened through a series of fiscal decisions, quiet treaty renegotiations, and incremental repositioning. Each step looked manageable at the time. The cumulative effect was the end of a global role. The structure of the thing was gone before anyone said it publicly. The gap narrative that applies here is specific. The official position from Washington remains that NATO is America's cornerstone commitment. The observable reality is that the United States has reduced functional engagement in European security planning while European capitals independently redesign their defense architecture. European defense procurement contracts written in 2025 are specifically structured to exclude American suppliers, not out of hostility, but out of supply chain security logic, the lesson of dependency absorbed from the post-2022 energy crisis. That gap between the announced commitment and the actual architecture is not a messaging problem. It is structural evidence of where the relationship is actually heading, and the mechanism accelerating this is already assembling itself. The European defense industrial base, dismissed for decades as fragmented and incapable of serious independent production, is being restructured at speed. KNDS, the Franco-German Defense Consortium, announced a doubling of artillery production capacity in January 2025. Rheinmetall, Germany's primary defense manufacturer, reported a 46% revenue increase in 2024. The industrial infrastructure of a self-sufficient European military capability is being built, line by line, factory by factory. Once that infrastructure is fully in place, the structural dependency that has anchored Europe to American decisions for 75 years no longer exists. That changes the calculation, permanently, irreversibly. Alliances do not end with declarations. They end with production lines. Step back from the defense budgets and the tariff figures for a moment. Because here is what all of this, the rearmament, the trade rupture, the collapse in values convergence, actually means for the shape of the world over the next 20 years. What I want you to take from this is not fear. Fear is not useful here. What is useful is the map, because when you understand the structural logic of what is happening, when you see the three fractures as a system rather than a series of separate accidents, you can see what is coming before any headline announces it. Here is what to watch. Watch Germany. Germany is the pivot point of everything that follows. The constitutional amendment passed in March 2025, specifically removing the debt brake to allow unlimited defense spending, crosses a political threshold that does not reverse itself with a change of government. Angela Merkel spent 16 years protecting that fiscal rule as a matter of principle. The fact that it was dissolved tells you the German strategic establishment has made a commitment that extends beyond any particular election cycle. Watch Article 5. The Mutual Defense Clause is the load-bearing wall of the entire NATO structure. If a scenario emerges anywhere on the eastern flank, the Baltic states, Poland, anywhere, in which American commitment to Article 5 is tested and found ambiguous, that ambiguity ends the alliance functionally, regardless of any formal declarations that follow. Watch European procurement language. When EU defense contracts begin explicitly excluding American suppliers as a standard clause, that is not a trade dispute. That is the architectural signal that the decoupling has moved from strategic intent to institutional practice. Now, I want to give the counter-argument a fair hearing, because serious analysts, people with genuine credentials and serious institutional experience, look at everything described here and arrive somewhere considerably calmer. Their argument: alliances adapt. The transatlantic relationship survived the Suez Crisis of 1956, when the United States actively undermined a joint British and French military operation. It survived de Gaulle's partial withdrawal in 1966. It survived the Iraq rupture. It survived Trump's first term and found its way back to formal solidarity. The institutional infrastructure, shared intelligence systems, interoperability standards, 75 years of combined military exercises is not easily dismantled. Europe has been talking about strategic autonomy since the 1990s and has consistently failed to deliver. American domestic politics are cyclical. What one administration dismantles, the next can reconstruct. That is a serious argument. There is genuine weight in it. The honest picture, stripped of both the panic and the complacency, is this: the alliance is not dead, but the assumptions on which it rested are dead. The assumption that American security guarantees are unconditional is gone. The assumption that trade disputes and security relationships stay in separate lanes is gone. The assumption that shared values automatically produce shared decisions, gone. What is replacing those assumptions is something more transactional, more conditional, and structurally more fragile. The Transatlantic Alliance of 1949 was built on a civilizational bet that shared history, shared enemies, and a shared catastrophic memory were sufficient to sustain a permanent partnership across an ocean. That bet was rational in 1949. Whether it is rational in 2025 with different threats, different economies, different domestic political conditions, and a different America is the question that no one in official circles will answer plainly. The most consequential transformation in international affairs right now is not occurring in Ukraine or the South China Sea or the Middle East. It is occurring in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris, in the quiet institutional language of procurement contracts, constitutional amendments, and budget line items. An alliance that took 75 years to build is being systematically, quietly redesigned. The redesign will continue to look like cooperation until the day it stops. The alliance is not over, but the one that existed is.